mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Welcome back, everyone. I am your host, Mike Brazier, and today we're going to be going up to sort of the northeastern part of North America for a habitat update. We are recording this on July 14th, so we're going to be doing a bit of a look back on spring habitat conditions and the way things have unfolded since then, and try to paint a bit of a picture on what folks might expect in terms of habitat conditions, what ducks and geese might have encountered whenever they went back up there. To help us with this conversation is a return guest on the podcast, Sarah Fleming, our Director of Conservation Programs for the Northeastern U.S., and Sarah is out of the Great Lakes Atlantic region. Sarah, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, looking forward to giving the update.
How are things up there mid-July? Been doing anything exciting? Actually, I know you and Mike went on a little bit of a trip here recently, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, we did. So Mike, my husband, and I headed up to St. John's, Newfoundland, head over to the Maritimes to take a look at some of the seabird colonies in that particular area. We were there about 5 days. It was really exciting and highly recommend it. Got a chance to see a lot of puffin colonies, gallinules, gannets. It's just incredible. There's 3 or 4 major ecological reserves up there, and it was really nice to be able to get out on some of the boats and see some of the project sites. But some of the biggest highlights were watching, humpback whales breaching 50 yards from shore, and being able to almost touch some of the northern gannet colonies that are up there. It was a really great time. So very relaxing.
Yeah, that's great. I saw some of the photos online that you posted, and just a remarkable landscape, remarkable observations of just those huge bird concentrations. Super, super cool. I was jealous.
Unfortunately, we didn't see any eiders, but they are nesting up in that area, just not where we were located.
I can't be too jealous because maybe about that same time, I was on the opposite side of the continent, the far edge of the Yukon Delta in Alaska, and I did see some eiders. I saw some spectacled eiders, which was an absolute treat for me. I haven't had a chance to talk about that on an episode yet, but we do have a few things lined up where we're going to be able to share some of those stories with some of the students that were up there with us. So, getting away, those remote locations, the downtime, an opportunity to recharge, and that's always great, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, and definitely needed. We're kicking off our new fiscal year, and it's really nice to kind of go out and kind of take a step back and see all the accomplishments, and able actually to check out some of the Ducks Unlimited work that's going on there. I hit up some of their projects, and it was kind of nice to see the bigger landscape perspective.
One of the things that we'll talk about here as we get into this conversation is, of course, the Canadian wildfires. Did the smoke affect you on your vacation there?
A little bit. We were fortunate comparatively to some elsewhere in the country that has been dealing with some pretty significant air quality warnings to the point where you shouldn't even be stepping outside your house. We had a little haze in the air, which did affect some of the ability to just be able to see distances, but no major warnings that were restricting our activity or requiring us to wear N9 masks. So fortunately that the winds were in our favor and didn't blow the smoke over to the Maritimes, but it has happened. It just wasn't happening during the time we were there.
Yeah, well, that's good. And like I said, we'll touch on that here in a bit more, a bit later on in the context of what those wildfires and those conditions might mean for breeding waterfowl. I've had several people reach out to us asking for sort of an assessment of what's this going to mean, or is it going to impact breeding populations to a degree that we'd be able to measure it or recognize it? Some of those comments came from folks that I think have an interest in wildfires in Western Canada, but of course there's wildfires all across Canada right now, or at least there were. I don't know the current. To be honest, I don't know the current status of wildfire occurrence and severity across Canada right now. But like a week or 2 weeks ago, whenever I was looking, they were quite abundant across that landscape. So we'll get into a little discussion of that, but. Sarah, I believe we're prepared to talk about, from a habitat condition update, 3 general geographies, and you can redefine these however it's appropriate for the way you want to discuss them. Portions of the Great Lakes, that's obviously a vital area for some locally produced ducks, and so we have a little bit of an update there. Also, Eastern Canada, the boreal forest and some of the other regions in that landscape, I think you have some information for us on, and then maybe some input for the Northeastern U.S. Did I capture that about right?
That's right. Yep.
All right. Well, which one would you like to start with?
Well, we might as well start going east to or west to east, if you want to do it that way, starting in the Great Lakes.
Okay.
And the conditions in the Great Lakes were very similar as you kind of head east through New York, all the way over to New England area, where as many listeners probably are aware, we had a relatively dry spring in the Northeast. However, good news is a lot of our ducks in this particular landscape, or these particular areas of ducks, don't rely on those ephemeral wetlands and are not as particular like they are in the prairies, where dry conditions don't have as much of a significant impact on the breeding populations. So we're very happy that our habitats in this part of the world are relatively stable. So a dry spring doesn't set us back too far. But the good news is we've been seeing a lot of rain in the near recently, and so any of those drier ponds have been regenerated and are providing some really good brood habitat right now. So that's all really good news in that respect. And then if I jumping up a little bit further north into the East Coast, into the eastern habitat area.
Before you do that, I wanted to do a bit of a mental calendar of things. We had talked to folks, it might have even been Mike that we spoke with back earlier in the year about how dry conditions were in like January, I think, in the Northeastern U.S. I think it was, I don't remember the characterization of exactly how dry it was, but I know it wasn't very conducive to moving birds around, creating new habitats during the hunting season. I recall that. But did those dry conditions in the Northeastern U.S. kind of persist into spring, and then only recently we've started to see some improvements? Kind of help us with that, the timing of things. So
yeah, as far as snow cover goes, we were relatively had less on average comparatively to maybe past years. So we did enter the spring with drier conditions, warmer temperatures this past winter. As you already alluded, we had a lot of birds stay a little bit further north just because it didn't get as cold and stuff didn't lock up as much. But the good news is the rains and stuff that have been happening over the last few months are helping regenerate a lot of those areas, and we did get some pretty big rains early in the spring to help make up for that loss of the snow cover and availability of water. So we're looking good. And as we all know, wetlands, it's not a bad thing sometimes to enter these seasons with some dry periods that allow the wetlands to cycle and regenerate. And then when we get the heavy spring rains, we get some really good lush vegetation that will take off and provide that good nesting cover and brood habitat. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that always useful reminder of how wetland systems in that part of the continent are different from some of the others that dominate a lot of our conversation. That's not to say things don't get dry there, as you described. I was reading a report, I think related to one of the next areas you'll talk about. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilots have recently completed their surveys, and most of those pilots create some sort of a little report of what they observed, and some of them contrasted with what they've seen in past years. And it was variable. The description from Maine all the way up into eastern Canada was some locations had improving wetland conditions compared to droughts over the past couple of years. But then I think that, I forget the actual geography specifically that was referenced, but there was one place where wetlands were noticeably lower in terms of water levels, but there's so many wetlands, and they're semi-permanent, permanent type wetlands, that there's still a lot of
still a lot of habitat there. So anyway, just that kind of, despite the stability, I guess my point in saying all that is despite the general stability of those systems that we talk about, they still can demonstrate noticeable effects of drought, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I was able to talk to some of our waterfowl biologists, and been to your point, these habitats are very stable, but fortunately we haven't been able to link any kind of real meaningful relationships between really dry conditions and an effect on production, just because there's so much on the habitat on the landscape, and these wetlands do cycle comparatively to the prairies where that relationship is much more in flux.
Well, then what about Eastern Canada? What were you able to learn? What kind of contacts were you able to make to help us get an idea of how things might be looking there?
Yeah, and again, very similar. The Northeast had very similar weather conditions, and I'll give a shout out to our Ducks Unlimited Canada partners who helped me compile some data for this report. But Atlantic Canada, again, experienced a dry spring, but with relatively average temperatures. The wetland water levels are providing good habitat conditions, so they're very pleased to see a lot of the broods and production that's going on there. Pretty much it's normal, maybe a little bit below normal in most areas, but as we've already indicated, that's pretty standard. They're stable areas, so we're not no concerns there. And goose broods have started to appear. So we've been seeing a lot of goslings running around, which is great. And there's been seeing a lot of waterfowl sitting on nests. So black ducks and mallards, and they're expecting those broods to be showing up soon in the areas where you'll be able to see them anyways. And then the current conditions are projecting that weather should continue the way it is and bode well for good brood success. Lots of good brood cover and rearing habitat. And then, assuming precipitation levels continue the way they are, we should be good going into the fall. So things are looking really good. And I do know our Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service partners will be finishing up some of their banding or starting their banding in August. So we'll be having some more data on kind of Canada goose populations after they complete those surveys.
Stay tuned to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, after these messages.
What other information were you able to get from the Great Lakes? Anything from that area? Because I know going back to like in the spring, I don't remember what conditions were like there over the winter period, but as they got into spring, I know their conditions were pretty good. But here over the past, couple of months, things have really entered a dry trend. Any additional insight there from the Great Lakes?
Similar. The Great Lakes had similar conditions. If we're talking Great Lakes north up into Ontario and then heading over to Eastern Canada as well as the New England area, I'd say similar trends. We entered the spring dry with having less snow cover than average, but rains and other conditions are allowing for good conditions. And similar to the Northeast here, the Great Lakes region has similar with stable wetland conditions, and we're not seeing as much of a flux in some of those areas. So I think all in all, we're going to have a good production over here in the Northeast.
Okay. I must be thinking about some of the more western states in the Great Lakes region that are well, at least they're starting to show some drought conditions based on some drought maps that I'm looking at. And but that's not necessarily as much of an issue for, let's say, spring breeding conditions. When we get to this time of the year and we start thinking about drying conditions, it turns more to concern over brood habitat or maybe re-nesters and things of that nature, right?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. And you're right. I apologize. I wasn't thinking over towards Wisconsin. I was thinking more Michigan east. But yes. So, yeah, you hit that right.
Yeah, okay. All good. I think you and I both talked briefly about some of the reports from Wisconsin, their duck survey. I didn't look at the reports from any of the other states, but I know Wisconsin does a breeding duck survey every year. And I think the breeding population estimates for ducks in that state were pretty similar to where they were last year. I forget what their pond numbers were like in that report, but it seemed about average, I guess, if I'm just trying to do high-level characterization of Wisconsin as the example, but you look at drought conditions now, and things have certainly. I'm looking at the July 11th drought map, and there's actually starting to show up in southern Wisconsin some extreme drought conditions. So, how that translates to changing water levels in that geography, though, I'll have to admit that I don't know, because I'm not as familiar with the wetland types there and what it takes to sort of dry up a wetland. Have you spent much time in Wisconsin or any of those landscapes?
Unfortunately, I have not. My area mostly has been over from, I'd say, Michigan east, but I'm assuming similar conditions where those areas are a little bit more stable comparatively to the prairies. But as you start to move more towards the Midwest, you're going to start to see similar prairie-like conditions where it will become more and more important that we have water in order to fill those wetlands from spring rains.
We'll bookmark that as a discussion topic for a future episode, and maybe bring on, I think Taylor Finger is the state waterfowl biologist up there. He'd be a good one to get on. I don't think we've had him on as a guest before, so we'll bookmark that. So Taylor, if you're listening, know that you're on our list. So the other topic that we did want to discuss, and you tell me if there's anything else to highlight here, Sarah, but wildfires and what should our reaction be? How should we think about those, given the scale, given the intensity, and help us think about what those wildfires mean from a waterfowl production standpoint this year, as well as long term, the extent to which we have any understanding.
Yeah, so it's definitely a very hot topic, and we've been receiving a lot of calls and inquiries about this topic. So I know it's something that's a lot of our state and federal agencies are keeping close tabs on. I was able to get some reports from Canadian Wildlife Service and also the provincial MNR, Ministry of Natural Resources agencies in Ontario and over in Quebec to help get a better handle on maybe what's going on up there. But it's not great in the sense that, we're seeing huge number of fires continuing to burn, and listeners can go to, there's some web pages online that you can go to and track the fires that are burning across the entire expanse of the boreal forest in Canada. I think some numbers I pulled today, it looks like there's almost 900 active fires right now across Canada, and 576 of those are considered to be almost out of control or very highly dangerous. So not great. And many of the particular a lot of these areas are averaging almost 2.2 million hectares, which equates to 5.4 million acres in size. So that's almost the size of Massachusetts when we start looking at the area that's being affected. So it was a little concerning. But the good news is, in the respect that a lot of our biologists are not too concerned. If we shift back to the Quebec area, boreal forests here over in the northeast part, there's been a paper published recently, or back in 2016, that has indicated that these particular fires in this boreal system are a natural occurrence, although we've been seeing some increases with changing climate and increasing temperatures and fluctuations in precipitation. But these fires are, their principal factor for disturbance, and they really do a good job of setting back forests and regenerating and creating heterogeneity, helping with the production of wetland systems by regenerating and allowing the vegetation to be set back. So the paper that was produced showed that basically, waterfowl populations are pretty resilient. They've adapted to these type of systems. They're mobile, and there's been no real strong correlation between fires and negative impacts on waterfowl production. So we're hopeful that those trends will continue. And we'll see that a lot of the fires burning right now in Quebec, some of the biggest and most dangerous ones are along James Bay. So that's northern parts of Ontario bordering Quebec. Fortunately, there's not a highly populated density of homes and cities in that area. So not seeing significant property damage, but from a waterfowl perspective, there's lots of ephemeral wetlands up there. And lots of areas where they can move to and hopefully continue their success with. So we're not seeing the trends are hopeful that we will not see effects on our population this year.
Yeah, that's good, and I appreciate you sharing that. The other thing that I would add to maybe, I guess it just amplifies what you were saying, that these are natural processes, And although they're scary, and we, from a human safety standpoint, we think about the wildlife affected by it, and sure, we can have those concerns, but these are natural occurrences. I was having a conversation with Fritz Reed a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the wildfires in Western Canada, and we got to talking about, I think I asked the question, what would be considered an old tree in the boreal forest? Because when we think about these as natural processes, that means they happen with some frequency, right? And he said that it's a pretty short return rate, return frequency as to when you see the time between subsequent fires in a given area. And so to put a number on that, I asked him what he would consider to be an old tree in the boreal forest, and he said, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years. So that tells you that the return frequency on these fires is pretty short in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, it can be scary when you throw out 900 fires and several million hectares of area affected, but I think it also is a useful reminder that this continues to be a natural process. The extent to which it may accelerate or become accentuated or more severe as a result of any other kind of activities is something that we'll continue to study and monitor, I guess. But yeah, for now, it sounds like folks should try to take this in stride and recognize that pretty much every year there's some degree of wildfire occurring across the boreal forest. This is one of those years where it seems to be a bit more extreme, right? Yeah,
it's just for one reason or another. And I think a lot of the people are asking how they get started. And a lot of this, again, natural occurrences, a lot of them are through lightning strikes, although some of them are a result of human fires or something. But most of them are lightning strikes. And a lot of the data supports that a lot of our boreal waterfowl, when they select critical nesting areas, they're really looking for high-quality brood-rearing lakes, and as opposed to nesting habitat as their particular area they want to hone in on. And the good news is that a lot of these fires, the regeneration of these quality brood-rearing habitats and the nesting cover, the vegetation will respond in less than a year. So even if a fire goes through and causes a significant amount of devastation, these habitats will bounce back relatively quickly. And the good news is it'll be available to the birds next year. Yeah,
very good. It actually reminds me of some of the discussions that we hear and about the beneficial effects of fire in other landscapes, whether we're talking about how it can be used to enhance management for wild turkeys or other ground nesting birds. I think there's always a useful education point to be made when these types of things occur. We will have. I'll make the point here that in about a month we'll have estimates from the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. That report is expected out mid to late August. And so that report will contain the numbers from the areas that we've talked about here. It will also include some more descriptions of habitat conditions encountered during the survey. So that information is something we'll look forward to. Anything else, Sarah, that is worth talking about that you wanted to mention here before we look to wrap up?
No, just looking forward to a productive fall. Really excited about some of the Northeast increases in bag limits and some of our opportunities here. So mallard bag limit is going back up, as well as the Canada goose. So I know all our waterfowl hunters will be very pleased to hear that. And with conditions looking the way they are, we're expecting to have a good production and hopefully a really good fall flight.
Well, hey, I'll pass along my well wishes to you and your husband, Mike. And I know it will not be long before you start dusting off those decoys and making sure the waders don't have holes in them and kind of mapping out where it is you're going to be hunting this year. So we're not it feels odd to say it's July and we're not too far away from it and we're still battling 95-degree temperatures, but it gets here in a hurry, doesn't it?
It does, and I could tell you a funny story sometime about how important it is to check your waders for holes.
I'm sure there are a lot of people that have that funny story, me included. So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us here. We'll look for opportunities to catch up with you again sometime between now and sometime throughout the hunting season. It's always great to catch up with you and Mike, and appreciate all the work that you and your staff are doing in the Northeastern U.S. to help deliver the important conservation work of Ducks Unlimited, and thank all the supporters that you have there. And so thanks a lot, Sarah. It's great having you.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I'll just kudos to the volunteers and members and our team over here. We couldn't do it without the support of everyone making this successful program.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Sarah Fleming, Director of Conservation Programs for the Northeastern U.S., working out of the Great Lakes Atlantic region. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who does a terrific job with all of these episodes and getting them out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your support of the podcast, and we thank you for your commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.